There is a man sitting on a concrete floor in the back of an Omaha shopping mall. He is locked in a small room with a dumpster. There is an emergency exit 2 feet from his hand. If he pushes it, he will be outside in the cold night air in less than a second. But he will not push it. He will sit on that floor, alone, for 2.5 hours, until a night cleaner finds him. And while he waits, he will take a loose screw out of the wall, and he will carve the initials of a name he is not allowed to say out loud anymore into the concrete beside him. That man had been running his whole life. From a store in Cicero, from his older brother, from his own first name, from a woman who loved him, from every version of himself he ever tried to build. Tonight, I want to tell you why. Section 1. The boy in the back room of the convenience store. Before Jimmy McGill was Slippin Jimmy, before he was Saul Goodman, before he was Takavic, before any of it, he was a kid in the back of a corner store in Cicero, Illinois, watching his father hand away money that the family could not afford to lose. That is where the running starts. Not in a courtroom, not in the desert, not in a shopping mall in Omaha. In a store that smelled like cardboard and old coffee, with a bell on the door that rang every time another man walked in to take advantage of Jimmy's dad. The show gives us this memory in pieces. A flashback in the 3rd season shows young Jimmy sitting behind the counter of the McGill family store, looking up at his father. A man walks in. The man is clearly a con artist. Anyone with any life experience would see it. He has a sad story about his car breaking down, about his wife and kids waiting, about needing just a little cash to get home. Jimmy's father listens. Jimmy's father nods. Jimmy's father opens the cash drawer and gives the man the money, and the man walks back out to his perfectly working car and drives away. Young Jimmy sees it, all of it. And the thing you have to understand about this scene is that it isn't played as a single event. Chuck, years later, will tell anyone who listens that this was not the first time. This was not the 10th time. The store was a parade of people like this man. Drifters and grifters and regulars who learned that if you told the right story to Charles McGill Sr., he would give you whatever was in the drawer. Because he was kind. Because he wanted to be helpful. Because he believed in people. The store went under. Of course it did. It could not have gone any other way. For a lot of kids, watching your family lose a business would teach you about money, or about hard work, or about the importance of being careful. Jimmy took a different lesson from it. The lesson Jimmy took was that the world is made of 2 kinds of people, and you get to pick which one you are going to be. You can be the man behind the counter, getting fleeced by strangers, smiling while you hand over the last of your savings, proud of your own kindness, even as the store dies around you. Or you can be the man with the sad story, walking out the door with the money, heading to the next mark. There is no third option. That is the rule Jimmy picks up in the back of that store. There is the sucker, and there is the one who works the sucker. Nothing in between. And once you see the world that way, you cannot unsee it. Every room you walk into for the rest of your life, you are sorting the people in it into those 2 buckets, and you are making sure, always making sure, that you are never the one in the wrong bucket. Jimmy picks his side early. By the time he is old enough to act on it, he is already stealing from the family register. Not a lot. A little here, a little there. He tells himself it does not matter, that his dad is bleeding out anyway, that the money would have gone to the next grifter through the door if Jimmy had not taken it first. And there is a piece of truth in that story. The store really was going to close. The money really was disappearing. But the story Jimmy is telling himself has a cost. And that cost is the first crack in who he is. He is the good son. That is his story about himself. He is the one who loves his father. He is the one who is not like the people who come in and take. And yet, he is taking, quietly, from the register, from the very man he loves. And the way he handles that contradiction, the way any kid handles that kind of contradiction, is he pushes it down and away. He tells himself his dad is a sap. He tells himself the money was going to be lost anyway. He tells himself he deserved it for having to watch all of this happen. None of those stories are fully true, but he needs them. He needs them so badly that he carries them with him for the next 40 years. There is a moment in the final season, deep in a flashback, where we see the coin collection. Jimmy, as a little boy, had a tin, a little Band-Aid box. He kept coins in it. Some of those coins were rare. Some were worth real money. One was a George Washington $50. His father, when he saw the coin, was alarmed. He assumed Jimmy had taken it from somewhere. He wanted to give it back. And Jimmy, still a child, learned right then that hiding was safer than asking. He tucked the Band-Aid tin up into a ceiling tile of the family store, and he left it there for years. Think about what that means for a second. A little kid hiding a box of his own possessions from his own father, in his own family's store, in a ceiling he has to climb to reach. That is not a kid who feels safe. That is a kid who has already learned that the people who are supposed to protect him cannot be trusted with the truth about who he is and what he wants. The ceiling tile is the first hiding place of many. It will not be the last. Years later, when he is a grown man, he will break back into that abandoned store with his old friend Marco. He will climb up and retrieve the Band-Aid tin. The coins will still be there. And in the way he talks about it, in the way he holds the tin in his hands, you can feel the weight of what it represents. This tiny metal box contains the proof that he has been hiding from the people he loves since before he can even remember why. The show is telling us something very specific here, and it is telling us slowly, across many seasons, because it wants us to really sit with it. Jimmy did not become a runner when he grew up. Jimmy was born running. Running from the man his father wanted him to be. Running from the scolding that would come if the coin collection was discovered. Running from his own hand in the cash drawer. Running from the understanding, which he had already formed by the time he was tall enough to see over the counter, that the world was going to treat him as either a fool or a thief, and he had already made his choice. And here is the part that matters most for the whole rest of his life. Jimmy never stops thinking of himself as the good son. He never lets go of that story. Even as he steals from the register, even as he runs the cons, even as he becomes Slippin Jimmy in the alleys of Cicero, a part of him is still the boy behind the counter who loved his dad and hated watching him get cheated. That part of him does not die. It just gets buried under every other version of himself he ever builds. And because it gets buried, because he never lets himself properly look at it, it stays exactly the way it was. The wound never heals because the wound is never touched. It just sits there, down at the bottom of everything, quietly shaping every move he makes. When his father finally dies, not long after the store closes, Jimmy's brother Chuck will come to believe something terrible about his little brother. Chuck will come to believe that Jimmy's thefts from the register were part of what killed their father. Not the only thing, maybe not the main thing, but a piece of the weight that broke the man. Chuck will carry that belief for the rest of his life. He will never say it out loud to Jimmy for a very long time, but he will act on it every day, in every small choice he makes about how to treat his brother. And Jimmy will feel it, the way you always feel the thing that the people in your family are not saying. And he will run from that too. This is the first running, and the most important one to understand, because every other running in his life is an echo of this one. The running from Chuck, the running from the law, the running from Kim when he could not bear for her to really see him, the running from Gene's quiet life in Omaha, the running from himself, all the way to the end. All of it starts in that store, with that kid, watching his dad get played, deciding which kind of man he was going to be, and then never quite managing to forgive himself for the choice. You can see, if you look closely, how the choice sits in the grown Jimmy's body. The constant motion, the patter, the never shutting up, the jokes that come too fast so that nobody has a chance to ask him a real question. The nicknames, one after another, Slippin Jimmy and Saul Goodman and Takavic. Each one a new surface for him to stand on when the last one starts to give way. This is a man who cannot sit still, because sitting still means being in the room with the kid from the store. And the kid from the store is carrying something he does not want to pick up. Notice also what he tells himself about his father. In a conversation with Marco, as a grown man, Jimmy will say that his dad was weak, that his father was only popular with the neighborhood because he was giving away the farm, that the store failing was really his dad's own fault for being too soft. This is not the loving version of the memory. This is the defensive version. This is the version Jimmy has to hold on to so that he does not have to feel the weight of what he did to his father and to the family. If his father was a sap, then taking from the register is not a betrayal. It is just reality. Just the way the world works. Just what anyone would have done in his shoes. That is how the running works. It is not that Jimmy forgets where he came from. He remembers it very clearly. What he does is rewrite it, piece by piece, so that the person he is today can live with the person he was then. And every time he tells himself the rewrite, the original gets a little harder to reach, and he has to run a little further to stay ahead of it. There is one more detail from this early part of his life that matters, and it is easy to miss. By the time Jimmy is a teenager, he is already running small cons on his own. Fake IDs for his classmates at school. Tricks in the schoolyard. Little scams for little money. This is before his friendship with Marco really takes off. This is before the Rolex cons in the bars. This is Jimmy, very young, already practicing the routine that will eventually become his whole life. He is a kid who has decided. The decision has been made. And from here, everything that happens to him is just the decision getting louder. Here is the thing that makes it all tragic instead of just sad. Jimmy is not a bad kid. He is not cruel. He is not empty. He loves his family. He is funny and quick and kind in his own ways. There is a real human being under all the running, and that human being wants the things any kid wants. He wants his dad to be proud of him. He wants his brother to like him. He wants to be good at something. He wants to be loved for who he is, not for the trick he just pulled. But the world he grew up in did not have room for that kid to get those things without having to choose between them and everything else. The store was dying. The father was soft. The brother was already pulling away. And so the kid learned to settle for being respected by the wrong people, at the cost of being trusted by the right ones. And once you learn that trade, It gets into your bones. You keep making it for the rest of your life, even when the stakes are totally different, even when you have outgrown the neighborhood that taught it to you. It is just what you do. It is what you know. By the time he is a young man, by the time he has a friend like Marco and a nickname like Slippin Jimmy, the pattern is set. He is going to run. He is going to keep moving. He is going to make people laugh so they do not have a chance to look too closely. He is going to take from the register, one way or another, for the rest of his life. And somewhere underneath all of it, he is going to keep telling himself that he is still the good son, still the boy behind the counter who loved his dad, still basically a decent guy who just got a bad hand. None of that is quite true. None of it is quite false either. That is what makes him so hard to look away from. He is a man walking in two directions at once, and he has been doing it so long he does not even know anymore which direction is real. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, underscore. But something happens in those Cicero alleys, with Marco at his side, that hardens all of it into a shape. The small con becomes a craft. The craft becomes an identity. The identity becomes a name, whispered in a bar by a young man pretending to be somebody else. And the name, the very first time it gets used, is not one you would guess. It is not Jimmy. It is not James McGill. It is something the boy in the store would not even recognize. And it is already there, waiting, in the cold of a Chicago winter. Section 2. Cicero, the alleys, and Slippin Jimmy. The name Slippin Jimmy did not come from nothing. It came from ice. Cicero winters are long and cruel. The sidewalks outside every store in town turn into sheets of black glass by the middle of December, and they stay that way until spring. For most people, this is a daily problem. Something to walk around, something to throw salt on. For Jimmy McGill, it was a business opportunity. The scam was simple. Jimmy would find a busy spot in front of a shop, a place where people were coming and going, a place where somebody might see him go down. He would walk out onto the ice, pick his moment, and he would fall. Hard. Not a real fall, a performance of a fall. He would hit the ground in a way that looked like his leg had gone out from under him, and he would stay down there, clutching his knee, making the small, pained sounds that make strangers want to help. Somebody would come over. Somebody always came over. And Jimmy, through gritted teeth, would explain that he thought his leg might be broken, that he could not afford a doctor, that he just needed a little help getting home. They would give him money. Not huge amounts. A 20 here, a 50 there, sometimes 100. He claimed once that a single really good slip had gotten him $8,000 in one go. Whether that story is exactly true or a little stretched does not really matter. What matters is that he was good enough at it that the neighborhood gave him a name. Slippin Jimmy. The kid who could not stay on his feet. The kid you had to watch out for if you saw him limping toward you on the sidewalk. A local character. A local joke. A local kind of famous. And here is the thing that is easy to miss when you hear the nickname. Slippin Jimmy is not a bad name to have if you are 16 years old in Cicero and you do not have much else going for you. It gets you known. It gets you respect from a certain kind of person. The older grifters in the neighborhood would see Jimmy come into the bar and they would nod at him. They knew what he was. He was one of them. He had earned the right to sit at the table. And for a kid whose father had been eaten alive by men like them, a kid who had already decided which side of that equation he was going to be on, Getting that nod was worth almost anything. This is the part of the story where Jimmy meets Marco. Or rather, where Jimmy and Marco become the pair that the rest of Cicero knew them as. Marco was a high school friend. A little slower than Jimmy, a little rougher. A good soul in his own rough way. And what Marco gave Jimmy, what Marco was for Jimmy in a way nobody else in his life ever quite was again, was a partner who did not judge him. Marco looked at Jimmy and saw talent, pure skill, the ability to read a mark and work a mark and walk away clean. Marco did not think Jimmy was wasting his life. Marco thought Jimmy was the best at something rare. And for Jimmy, who had grown up listening to his brother's quiet disappointment, that was a new feeling. That was a feeling he did not know how to get anywhere else. Together, they ran a con they got very good at. The Rolex scam. It worked like this. Marco would lie down in an alley near a bar, pretending to be passed out drunk. On his wrist, he would be wearing a fake Rolex. Cheap copy, the kind you could buy for $20 from a guy with a suitcase. Jimmy would be inside the bar. He would strike up a conversation with somebody, usually a man who looked like he had a little money. Usually a man who had already had a few drinks and was feeling loose. Jimmy would befriend him, make him laugh, get a few more drinks into him. And then when the two of them walked out together, they would happen to stumble across Marco, unconscious in the alley, with what looked to be a very expensive watch just sitting there on his limp wrist. Jimmy would play the scene just right. "Oh, look at this guy. Look at that watch. That is a real Rolex. That is worth thousands." And then, slowly, carefully, the Mark would start to think about it. The Mark would look at the unconscious man. The Mark would look at the watch. The Mark would think about his wallet and the cash in it, and the math would start doing itself in his head. By the end of it, the Mark would be handing Jimmy all his money in exchange for a $20 fake, and he would be walking away thinking he had just pulled off the deal of a lifetime. Jimmy and Marco would meet up later, split the cash, and laugh about it over beers. The Rolex scam is important because it tells you something about what Jimmy was actually learning in those years. He was not just learning how to lie. Plenty of people can lie. What Jimmy was learning was how to read people, how to spot the want in a stranger's face, and then offer them exactly the story that would feed it. The Mark in the bar did not get taken because Jimmy tricked him. The Mark got taken because Jimmy figured out what the Mark already wanted to believe, and then handed him the belief. That is a much harder skill than simple lying. And Jimmy was, even as a young man, very good at it. You can see why this would feel good to him. Remember what he came from. Remember the kid behind the counter, watching his father get fleeced, deciding he would never be the one in that seat again. The Rolex scam is the inside-out version of that scene. Jimmy, now, is the man walking in with the story. Marco is the prop. The Mark is his father in a way. Every Mark is his father in a way. And Jimmy gets to walk out with the money every single time. There is a revenge in this that he would never admit to out loud. Maybe not even to himself. But it is there. You can feel it in the way he tells the stories later. Years later, when he is a grown man with a law degree, remembering his old cons with something close to fondness. So that is the first running. That is what Cicero taught him. It taught him that if you stay moving, if you stay ahead of the story, you can live. You can even have fun. You can have a friend like Marco. You can walk into a bar and have people know your name. You can be somebody, as long as you keep the act going, and never let anyone look too closely at what is behind it. But here is the crack in the whole thing. The crack that the show keeps quietly pointing at, and that Jimmy never quite manages to see in himself. The slip and fall scam, the thing that gave him his name, the thing he was so proud of being good at, is based on an act of fake helplessness. The whole con depends on Jimmy looking like a victim, on Jimmy looking hurt, on Jimmy lying on the ground and needing a stranger's pity to get up. To run the con, he had to practice, over and over, how to look like the thing he was most afraid of being, how to look weak, how to look pathetic, how to be the kind of man the world steps over on a sidewalk. He got so good at it that one day, outside a department store called Marshall Field's, he actually hit the ground wrong. A real fall, not a performance. He came down too hard and he broke both his knees. This is not a metaphor the show made up. This is something Jimmy mentions years later in a flashback in the final season, when he and Chuck are back in their childhood home. Both knees, out for months. And the reason he was on the ground in the first place was because he was pretending to be broken. He was so committed to looking broken that his body made it real. If you want to understand why Jimmy was always running, sit with that detail for a minute. This is a man who learned, young, that the way to get what you want in the world is to look like you are already defeated. To make yourself small and hurt in front of strangers so that they will open their wallets. And he did this so often and with such commitment that his body finally agreed with him and actually broke. That is what the running looks like from the inside. You are not running because you are winning. You are running because if you stop, even for a second, the audience might notice that the limp is fake. And if the limp is fake, what else is fake? And if everything is fake, what is underneath it all? These are not questions Jimmy could afford to ask himself. So he kept the act going. He kept moving. He kept finding new marks and new bars and new winters to work. The scams started to escalate, as these things do. What began as slip and falls turned into the Rolex scam. The Rolex scam turned into bigger tricks. There was a night, eventually, that Jimmy tells us about only in pieces across the series, where something went badly wrong. He was angry at a man he thought had slept with his ex-wife. He climbed up onto the roof of the man's car. He opened the sunroof, and he defecated down through it into the front seat. What Jimmy did not know, and what he learned only when the sirens arrived, was that the man's 2 young children had been sitting in the back seat the entire time. They had seen it happen. They were traumatized. The man pressed charges. Jimmy was looking at serious time, and there was nobody in Cicero who could help him. There was only one person, and Jimmy did not want to make the call. He called Chuck. Chuck was already a lawyer in Albuquerque at that point, already successful, already the pride of the family, or what was left of the family. And Chuck, after some thought, came and pulled his little brother out of the fire. But not for free. Chuck had one condition. Jimmy had to leave Cicero. Jimmy had to quit the scams. Jimmy had to come to Albuquerque and work in the mailroom of Chuck's law firm, under Chuck's eye, in a job where the worst trouble he could get into was filing something in the wrong box. This is one of the most important moments in Jimmy's life, and the show treats it with the respect it deserves. Because what is happening, underneath the surface, is that Chuck is offering Jimmy a deal. And the deal is the exact deal that Jimmy has been refusing ever since that day in the store. The deal is, be the sap. Be the man behind the counter. Be the one who plays by the rules and gets less money, and does not get to be a big shot, and does not get a nickname in the neighborhood. Be safe. Be small. Be respected in the boring way. Be the kind of person your brother can be seen with. Jimmy, with no other option, says yes. He goes to Marco. This is one of the quiet heartbreaks of the show, and you can feel it in the way the scene is written and played. Jimmy has to say goodbye to the only person who ever looked at him and saw skill instead of shame. Marco does not get it. Marco thinks Jimmy is wasting his talent. Marco thinks he is making a mistake. And Marco, in his own way, is right. Because the part of Jimmy that is alive, the part that feels like himself, the part that knows what it is to be good at something, is going to die a little bit every day in that mailroom. But Jimmy goes anyway. He gets on the plane. He leaves Cicero. He leaves Marco. He leaves the alleys and the bars and the ice and the nickname. He tries, really tries, to be the person his brother is asking him to be. This is where most people get the story of Jimmy McGill wrong. They think the Slippin Jimmy years were the bad years, and the Albuquerque years were the good ones. The years he cleaned up. The years he tried to be a lawyer. The years he almost got away from who he used to be. That reading misses what is actually happening. Because the running did not stop when Jimmy got on that plane. The running just changed direction. In Cicero, Jimmy was running from the idea of being the sap. He was running toward the con, toward the cash, toward the laugh at the end of the night. It was one kind of running, fast and loud and full of fake Rolexes and real bruised knees. In Albuquerque, Jimmy would start running the other way. Running from Slippin Jimmy. Running from the neighborhood kid. Running from the nickname and the scams and everything Marco had stood for. He would be running, very hard, towards something he wanted even more than the thrill of a good con. He would be running toward the respect of his brother, toward the chance to be seen, finally, by Chuck, as a real person, instead of the embarrassing younger sibling who had to be bailed out of jail every couple of years. This running would last years. It would take him through night school, through a correspondence law degree he paid for himself and kept secret, through the bar exam, which he passed with no fanfare and no one clapping for him, except one quiet woman in the corner of the room, through a ceremony, eventually, in which Chuck would stand up in front of a room full of lawyers and officially introduce his little brother as a new member of the bar. For a few years in there, something amazing almost happened. Jimmy almost stopped running. He almost arrived. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the thing about running toward your older brother's approval, when you do not understand what your older brother actually feels about you, is that you can run in that direction for a very long time before you find out that the finish line was never going to move when you got close to it. And the moment Jimmy did find out, the moment the truth about what Chuck really thought of him came out of Chuck's own mouth, was the moment all that hopeful running would turn, in a single afternoon, into the longest run of his life. Section 3. The Mailroom Promise and the Years Jimmy Spent Running Toward Something. The mailroom of Hamlin and McGill, in the basement of a glass tower in downtown Albuquerque, is where Jimmy McGill spent some of the strangest years of his life. Strange because nothing he did down there looked important. Strange because by any ordinary way of measuring, he was going nowhere. Strange because, for the first and almost only time in the whole show, a man who had spent his entire life running away from things had turned around and started running towards something instead. He sorted mail. That was the job. Letters came in, letters went out, and somewhere in between, a man in his 30s with no real future pushed a cart around a hallway and dropped envelopes into wooden slots. He wore a tie. He did not run any scams. He did not skip out on his work. He arrived on time. He stayed late. He did the small, dumb, necessary things that keep a law firm running. And he did them without complaint. Because his brother Chuck had told him this was the cost of staying out of jail. And because somewhere underneath the tie and the cart, there was a part of him that wanted, desperately, to be the kind of person who deserved to be there. He was not the only person in the mailroom. There was a young woman named Kim Wexler, working her way through school, who was doing the same job. She and Jimmy became friends first. Later, they would become more. But in those early mailroom days, they were two people in the basement of the same building, sharing the same lunch breaks, smoking cigarettes in the parking garage, talking about the lawyers upstairs and the kind of life they might have one day if things went right. Kim was already pointed upward. She was serious, and she was careful, and she was studying. Jimmy watched her, and he noticed, maybe for the first time in his life, that there was another way to live. Not the con, not the scam, not the running, just the work. Slow and steady and boring and real. He started to want what she had. That is the key thing to understand about this period in Jimmy's life. For the first time, he looked at a legitimate future and did not laugh at it. He looked at the idea of being a lawyer, like his brother, and he let himself want it. Not as a joke, not as a long con, as an actual plan. So he did something that nobody who had known Slippin Jimmy and Cicero would have predicted. He signed up for college. He finished his degree in secret. He did not tell Chuck. He did not tell anyone at the firm. He knew how it would look. He knew what people would say if they heard that the mailroom guy was studying for a law degree on the side. So he kept it quiet. He read in his apartment at night. He did the work. He finished. Then he did something even harder. He enrolled in a law school that you could complete through the mail. A correspondence school. Not a famous one, not a good one in the way Chuck's school had been good. A school that a lot of real lawyers would have rolled their eyes at. But it was a law school, and it gave a law degree. And if you passed the bar exam at the end of it, you were a lawyer just the same as anybody else. So Jimmy studied for years. Case law, torts, contracts, the kind of dry reading that would bore most people to tears, and he did it alone in his small apartment after his shifts in the mailroom. He failed the bar exam. Then he failed it again. And then, finally, he passed it. Think about what this means for a second. This is a man who, for most of his life, took the shortcut. This is a man whose entire working theory of the world was that the smart play was to go around the long way, not through it. This is a man who had spent years lying down on sidewalks to fake injuries for small money. And here he was, in his 30s, studying torts in a cheap apartment, failing a test, and then going back to study more. There is no con shortcut for the bar exam. You cannot fake your way past it. You have to actually know the law. You have to actually put in the hours. For years, Jimmy put in the hours. And here is the part that people sometimes miss when they talk about Jimmy's fall. Jimmy did this for Chuck. Not just for himself. Not just because he wanted a better life. He did it because some small, stubborn part of him still believed that if he could just show his older brother that he was capable of being a serious person, everything would be different. That Chuck would see. That Chuck would nod. That Chuck would finally say the thing that every little brother wants to hear from the older brother he has spent his whole life looking up to. You did good. You are one of us now. You belong. This is why the mailroom years are so heartbreaking, in a quiet way that the show takes its time to build. Because on the surface, it looks like a guy being boring. Nothing happens. He pushes a cart. He sorts envelopes. He and Kim share cigarettes in the garage. But underneath, a man is running. Running harder than he has ever run in his life. Running toward a version of himself that he has been told over and over he is not allowed to have. And he keeps running, year after year, because on the other side of the finish line, he believes, his brother is waiting with open arms. When he finally passes the bar, Jimmy tells only one person first. Kim. She hugs him. She is genuinely happy for him. You can feel in that moment what she is to him, even before they are a couple in any real sense. She is the only person in his adult life who looks at him and sees what he is trying to do without sneering at it. Then he goes to tell Chuck. The scene where Jimmy shares his bar exam success with the larger world is a small ceremony at the firm itself. There is a cake. Howard Hamlin is there. A few of the partners are there. Chuck is there. And on the surface, it is a celebration. There are smiles. There is applause. Jimmy is beaming. He has done the thing. He has actually done the thing. For the first time in his life, he has earned something that nobody can take away from him. A law license. His name, James Morgan McGill, now followed by those 3 little letters, Esquire. But the show is careful, even in that scene, to show you something underneath the celebration. Because after the cake and after the applause, Jimmy asks Chuck the question. The real question. The question he has been carrying around in his chest for years. He asks if there is a job for him at HHM. Not as a mailroom clerk. As a lawyer. As a real attorney at the firm where his brother is a named partner. Because of course, that is what he wants. That is what he has been running toward this whole time. He has imagined it. He has played it in his head. Chuck welcoming him in. Chuck showing him to his new office. Chuck introducing him to the other lawyers as his brother. His little brother, who finally made it. Howard Hamlin tells him no. And Jimmy, not knowing any better at that point, assumes that the no is coming from Howard. He assumes Howard does not like him. He assumes Howard thinks he is not good enough. He gets angry at Howard. He resents Howard for years. He spends season after season seeing Howard as the bad guy who would not let him into the club. What Jimmy does not know, and what the audience learns slowly across the first season, is that the no did not come from Howard. The no came from Chuck. Chuck did not want his brother at the firm. Chuck had been blocking him from the very start. Chuck had told Howard, behind closed doors, that Jimmy was not to be hired. That Jimmy was not to be treated as a real lawyer. That Jimmy was to be kept at a distance, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how well he did, no matter what letters he could now put after his name. All those years in the mailroom, all those nights studying, all those failed bar exams and the one he finally passed. All of it was for a brother who had already made up his mind that it would not matter. The finish line was not moving away from Jimmy because he was running too slow. The finish line had never been there in the first place. There was no finish line. There was just Chuck, watching him run, deciding ahead of time that wherever Jimmy got to, it would not be enough. You can see, when you watch the show a second time knowing this, how cruel some of Chuck's small gestures actually were. The way Chuck would listen to Jimmy tell stories about his cases and nod politely and say the right things, all while planning to block him. The way Chuck would let Jimmy believe, for years, that they were moving toward something together. The way Chuck would accept Jimmy's help when he was sick with his electricity problem, letting Jimmy shop for him and bring him groceries and ice for his cooler. taking all of that love and care while quietly working to keep Jimmy out of the life Jimmy was trying so hard to build. There is a scene in the second season that captures this better than almost any other. Jimmy gets a job offer from a different firm, a good firm, Davis and Main. They want him. They are willing to pay him well and give him a real office and treat him like a real lawyer. And Jimmy, excited, brings the news to Chuck. He expects his brother to finally be proud of him. He expects this to be the moment. He has done it without HHM. He has done it on his own. And now, surely, Chuck will see. Chuck does not say the thing Jimmy needs to hear. Chuck cannot say it, because saying it would mean letting go of the older brother's position. The position of being the real McGill, the successful one, the one the family points to. If Jimmy is also a successful lawyer, then the neat division of the family is broken, and Chuck would have to share a room in the family story with a brother he does not respect. So Chuck holds the line. Chuck keeps his feelings to himself, at least at first. And Jimmy, sensing that something is wrong but not yet knowing what, takes the job at Davis and Main anyway and tries, one more time, to build the legitimate life he has been aiming at. He moves into a nice apartment. He drives a company car. He wears better suits. He commits to playing by the rules. He tells himself that this is it. This is the version of him that is going to stick. Jimmy McGill, serious lawyer. It does not stick. It cannot stick. And part of why it cannot stick is because of something that had happened to Jimmy not long before. Something that had cracked the fragile shell of his new legitimate self before the Davis and Main job even started. His friend Marco had died. Marco, from Cicero. The one person in his life who had seen Slippin Jimmy and thought he was something beautiful. Jimmy had gone back to Cicero for a week after an early low point in the first season. He and Marco had run scams together, old Rolex cons, for one last week. And during the last scam of that week, Marco had dropped dead of a heart attack in an alley, with Jimmy holding him. Marco's last words had been that this week had been the best week of his life. Jimmy took Marco's pinky ring home with him. He wore it for years. He would still be wearing it, decades later, in a shopping mall in Omaha, on the night he pulled his final big scam. The ring mattered, because the ring was a small, heavy piece of proof that the Slippin Jimmy part of him was real and mattered. It was proof that there was a version of him somebody had loved. It was proof that the running in Cicero had not been meaningless. And every time Jimmy looked down at that ring, every time his thumb brushed against it in a meeting at Davis and Main, every time he felt it there on his finger when he was pretending to be the clean, serious lawyer Chuck wanted him to be, the ring was quietly whispering to him, "You are not this. You are not this. You are somebody else. You are somebody else." The tragedy of these years is that Jimmy was running toward something real. He was. The bar exam was real. The work was real. Kim was real. The want to be a good person and a good lawyer was real. If anyone had simply looked at him and said, "Hey, we see you. You are one of us now," he might have stayed. He might have held on to it. He might have been boring and legitimate and slow and safe for the rest of his life. And he would have called that happiness. But nobody looked at him and said that. Not the person who's saying it would have counted. Not Chuck. Chuck was the one person in the world who had the power to turn the running toward into the running home. And Chuck refused to do it. Chuck stood at the finish line, and every time Jimmy got close, quietly moved it another mile back. Jimmy kept running for a while anyway. That is the thing to understand. He kept running toward it. Even after the Davis and Maine job started to slip out from under him. Even after small cracks started to show. Even after he found himself pulling small cons in the margins of his legitimate life just to feel like himself again. He wanted to believe the finish line was real. He wanted it so badly. There was going to come a day, though, when Chuck would say the truth out loud. Not behind closed doors. Not through Howard. Not in small, cold gestures at family dinners. Out loud, to Jimmy's face. In a single, short sentence that would undo everything Jimmy had built in Albuquerque and send him running in a direction he could not come back from. Section 4. What Chuck actually said and what Jimmy actually heard. The sentence that broke Jimmy McGill was 9 words long. You could fit it on a napkin. You could say it in under 3 seconds. And when his brother finally said it to his face, in the living room of a house Jimmy had been taking care of for years, something in Jimmy snapped in a way that never really healed. The moment happens in the last episode of the first season. Jimmy has found out, through a lucky break at a copy shop, that Chuck has been the one blocking him from a job at HHM this whole time. Not Howard. Chuck. His own brother. The man he has been running errands for. The man he has been bringing groceries to. The man he has been wrapping in space blankets and pretending to believe about the electricity sickness. Because that is what you do for family, even when family is hard. Jimmy goes home and he sits with this information and he stews. And then he drives to Chuck's dark house, lit only by the gas lanterns Chuck insists on. And he asks his brother directly, why? And Chuck tells him. Chuck tells him that he is not a real lawyer. Chuck tells him that letting Jimmy practice law is like letting a monkey carry a machine gun. Chuck tells him that the entire family knew all along that Jimmy had been stealing from the cash register of the family store when they were kids. That their father had known. That their mother, on her deathbed, had asked only for Jimmy. Not for Chuck. For Jimmy. Even at the very end of her life, after everything, she wanted the son who had been a thief. Chuck says all of this with a tired calm that is worse than shouting would have been. Because the calm tells Jimmy that this is not a new thought. This is not something Chuck is coming up with in the heat of the moment. This is something Chuck has been sitting with for decades, carrying around, polishing. He has had these sentences ready in his mouth for most of Jimmy's adult life, and he has finally let them out. And then Chuck says the sentence, the 9 words that do the real damage. You have never mattered all that much to me. Jimmy sits in that chair and he hears it. You can see him hear it. His face does not do anything dramatic. He does not cry. He does not shout. Something deeper than that is happening. The story he has been telling himself for his entire life is, in that second, coming apart. Because Jimmy had been running toward this man. Running toward him through the mailroom. Running toward him through night school. Running toward him through the bar exam and the Davis and Maine job and the quiet, careful version of himself he had been trying to build in Albuquerque. The whole point had been Chuck. The whole point had been to be good enough one day that Chuck would look at him and see him and accept him. The whole 10-year sprint of Jimmy's adult life had a destination. And the destination was that man, in that chair, in that lantern-lit living room. And the destination had just told him that the finish line was never real. Here is the thing you have to understand about what Chuck does in that scene. He is not lying to hurt Jimmy. If anything, that would be easier to come back from. Jimmy could forgive a lie. A lie would mean Chuck did not really feel that way, that Chuck was just angry, that they could patch it up over time. No, Chuck is telling the truth. Chuck really does feel this way. Chuck really does believe that Jimmy is, at the bottom of him, a con artist who cannot be reformed. Chuck really has spent Jimmy's whole adult life quietly working against him. Chuck really did think the two of them were only ever pretending to be close, while Jimmy thought they were actually close. For Jimmy, the worst part is not that Chuck is cruel. The worst part is that Chuck is his brother, his older brother, the person he has used his whole life as the measure of what a serious man was. If Chuck thinks he is a fraud, then maybe he is a fraud. If Chuck thinks the law degree was a dressed-up con, then maybe it was. If the smartest and most respectable person in the family has spent 4 decades watching Jimmy and has concluded that Jimmy is and always will be the kid who stole from the family register, then who is Jimmy to argue? Chuck knows him. Chuck has seen him. Chuck has the receipts. And so the hearing of this speech is not just painful. It is a kind of verdict, a jury of one, and the juror is the only person whose opinion Jimmy has ever really cared about. The verdict is in. The verdict is guilty. The verdict has always been guilty, apparently, going all the way back to the store in Cicero. Jimmy had been going to court for decades without knowing the trial was already over. From this moment on, Jimmy is still going to try, for a while, to be the serious person he wanted to be. He is going to take the Davison, Maine job. He is going to show up. He is going to wear the suits. But something in him has cracked, and you can see the crack every time he steps into that nice new office. A man does not run toward a finish line he no longer believes in. A man does not work for the approval of a brother who has told him plainly that the approval was never coming, and that the chase was always a little pitiful to watch. Something is going to have to give. What gives, eventually, is Jimmy's commitment to the long way around. What gives is his willingness to put in the slow, boring, legitimate hours of a legitimate life. Because if the slow, legitimate hours were never going to pay off anyway, if Chuck was always going to see him as Slippin Jimmy with a law degree no matter what, then why not lean into it? Why not be Slippin Jimmy with a law degree? Why not use the skills from Cicero on the cases he was already handling? Why not make everything easier and faster and more fun? And if some rules got bent along the way, well, the man in the dark house had already decided what Jimmy was. What did it matter now if Jimmy agreed with him? That is the logic, and it is terrible logic. And Jimmy cannot see how terrible it is because he is too hurt to see anything clearly. Chuck has done something very specific to him. Chuck has taken away the reason to be good. Not the ability, not the opportunity. The reason. Because the reason, all along, had been Chuck. The brothers do not fully reconcile. They will fight again. Jimmy will pull a scheme involving Chuck's insurance company, a scheme designed to get Chuck to reveal just how mentally unwell he really was. And that scheme will contribute to Chuck being pushed out of his own law firm. There is a court hearing in the middle of the 3rd season where Jimmy will lay a trap for Chuck in open court, and Chuck will fall into it in front of a room full of lawyers, including his own ex-wife. And he will break down in a rant about Jimmy that finally shows everyone in the room how sick he actually is. Chuck's career will collapse. Chuck will lose the thing that has held him together. And not long after, Chuck will die in a fire in his own home. A fire that the show shows us is not an accident. The show lets you draw your own conclusion about that fire. The fire department rules it an accident. The obituary calls it an accident. But what we see on screen, on the last night of Chuck's life, is a man who has been pushed past the edge of what his pride can take. A man kicking over a lantern on purpose. A man deciding that he is done. Jimmy will find out about the fire the next morning when Howard shows up at his door and tells him. The last thing Chuck ever said to Jimmy, in person, while they were both still alive, was that Jimmy had never mattered that much to him. Imagine carrying that around for the rest of your life. Imagine being the person whose last conversation with your older brother ended that way. Imagine your brother dying before you could fix it, before he could take it back, before you could even figure out whether he meant it or was just angry. That door is closed now, closed forever. And on the other side of it is the only person who could have ever given you the thing you have been running toward your entire life. Jimmy cannot stay still after this. He cannot sit down with the feeling. It is too big. So he does what he has always done. He runs. But this time, something is different. This time, he is not running towards something. He is not running toward Chuck's approval, because Chuck is gone, and Chuck would not have given it anyway. He is not running toward a cleaner version of himself, because that version was only ever built for Chuck to see. He is running in a new direction now, a direction that will take the rest of his life to understand. He is running away from Jimmy McGill. Because if Jimmy McGill is a fraud, the way Chuck always said he was, then Jimmy McGill is not a name worth keeping. It is a name that is going to hurt every single time he hears it. A name that will always have Chuck's voice attached to it, saying the 9 words in the lamplight, calmly. If he wants to keep moving, if he wants to keep breathing, if he wants to keep practicing law at all, he is going to need a new name. A name without Chuck in it. A name without the store. A name without the mailroom and the nights alone studying, and all the hope he had poured into a person who had been quietly throwing it on the ground. He already has one. He has had it since Cicero. It is a name he used to use in bars, decades ago, when he was running Rolex scams with Marco. A name that sounds a little like, "It's all good, man." A name that nobody in Albuquerque associates with the broken McGill boy. A name that sounds loud and cheap and funny. A name you could paint on the side of a bus. A name that does not belong to anyone Chuck ever knew or disappointed or rejected. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 3, underscore, underscore. And yet, before Jimmy fully became that name, before he fully leaned into the loud, cheap, funny version of himself that the rest of the world would one day know from television commercials and strip mall billboards, there was one person still standing in his life who could have held him back from it. One person who could have pulled him sideways into a different life. One person who, for a while, almost did. Section 5. Kim Wexler and the brief possibility of standing still. Kim Wexler is the only person in the entire story who ever came close to making Jimmy McGill stop moving. Not slow down, not take a breath between scams, actually stop. And the fact that even she, in the end, could not hold him still, is what makes her the most important character in the whole show, besides Jimmy himself. You meet Kim early. She is there in the pilot, in the parking garage of HHM, smoking a cigarette, while Jimmy beats on a trash can after a rough meeting with Howard. She does not rush over to him. She does not lecture him. She just stands a few feet away, letting him get it out, offering him a smoke when he is done. That is who Kim is from the very first scene. Steady, present, not in a hurry to fix anyone, willing to sit next to a mess without flinching. She and Jimmy had known each other for years by the time the show starts. They had worked together in the HHM mailroom, back when Kim was still in law school and Jimmy was still sorting envelopes and quietly studying for his own degree. They had been friends first. They had been a couple at some point in the past. By the time the show opens, they are somewhere in between. Close in a way that is hard to put a name on. The kind of closeness where you do not need to explain things to each other. The kind of closeness where you share a cigarette without saying anything, and that is not awkward, and both of you walk away feeling a little better. Kim matters to Jimmy for a reason that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Everyone else in his life wants him to be something. Chuck wants him to be a respectable lawyer or nothing. Howard wants him to be far away from the firm. The clients want him to get them off. The cartel, later, will want him to keep their secrets. Kim is the only person who looks at Jimmy, at the whole man, the Slippin Jimmy and the serious lawyer, and the elder law attorney with the patience, and the con man with the fake Rolexes, and does not need him to pick one. She sees it all. She does not try to fix it. She just lets him be the complicated thing he is, and she stays. For Jimmy, who had spent his life running from one version of himself to the next, this was new. Nobody had ever done this. Not Chuck. Chuck wanted one Jimmy and rejected the rest. Not his mother, not his father, not Marco even, who had loved the Slippin Jimmy side of him, but did not have much patience for the part of Jimmy that wanted to be clean and serious. Kim was the first person who could sit in a room with the whole man. In the early seasons, you can see Jimmy slowing down around her. Not in a big, obvious way. In small ways. The patter quiets. The jokes get a little less loud. He listens more. He tells her the truth about things he would never tell anyone else. He messes up, and he comes to her afterwards, and he says, "I messed up," and she does not flinch. She tells him the truth back. Sometimes the truth is that what he did was wrong. Sometimes the truth is that she is worried about him. Sometimes the truth is that she loves him. All of these are things Jimmy has not really heard from another person as an adult. They build a little life together. They move into a fancy apartment with a glass countertop. They work in the same office suite for a while, under the name Wexler McGill, two solo practices that happen to share a waiting room. They pick out paint colors. They argue about cup holders. These are the small, boring things that people do when they are trying to be in a life instead of running through one. And for a while, Jimmy tries. You can see him trying. Kim has offered him something he has wanted without knowing how to ask for it, and he is trying, really trying, to deserve it. But here's the thing about Kim that makes the whole story more complicated and more honest than a simple good girl meets bad boy love story. Kim is not purely good. Kim is not Jimmy's angel. Kim has her own running going on underneath the steady surface. Kim grew up in a small town with a mother who was a drinker and a thief, and Kim got out of that town the way a lot of people get out of that kind of town, through sheer hard work and a refusal to ever relax. She had put on the sensible suits. She had studied law. She had climbed her way up from mailroom clerk to associate. She had done everything right. And inside her, there was another woman who liked the thrill of a good con, who enjoyed the little scams Jimmy ran, who got a little rush when she saw him work a mark in a bar. The show reveals this quietly, piece by piece. One of the earliest hints is a night in the second season when she and Jimmy pick out an obnoxious lawyer at a bar, pretend to be strangers with an investment opportunity, and talk him into buying an absurdly expensive bottle of tequila. Nobody gets seriously hurt. The mark is a jerk. The tequila gets paid for. But the look on Kim's face, walking out of the bar arm in arm with Jimmy, is a look of joy. Real joy. the kind of joy she does not get from closing a banking deal. This is the thing. Kim is not being corrupted by Jimmy. Not exactly. Kim is meeting, through Jimmy, a part of herself that she has been keeping tied up for decades. Jimmy is the excuse. Jimmy is the permission slip. But the want is hers. That is why the story is so painful. Because there are two people here who could have calmed each other down. Two people who, if either one of them had been just a little more whole, could have pulled the other one off the road. Instead, they go the other way. They feed the part of each other that was already hungry for trouble. And because they love each other, because they really do, neither of them sees clearly how much worse they are making everything. There are little test moments along the way where Kim almost pulls them both back. In the 4th season, when Jimmy is about to do something really reckless, Kim tells him no. She draws a line. Jimmy respects it, mostly. Later, when Jimmy's license is on the line, Kim stands up in front of a panel and defends him with the full force of her professional self. She is willing to burn a piece of her own reputation to save him. And the minute she walks out of that room, Jimmy tells her that his speech was a performance, that he is going to practice law under the name Saul Goodman, that nothing in the speech was real. And Kim's face does something small and awful, and she turns and walks away down the hallway, alone. That scene is one of the quiet turning points of the whole show. You can almost see her decide, in that hallway, that if she cannot pull Jimmy out of it, she might as well join him in it. The place where things really break is a scheme they cook up against Howard Hamlin. Howard had done nothing, really, to deserve what they do to him. Howard had been a stuck-up guy. Howard had bruised Kim's pride a few too many times over the years. Howard had, in Jimmy's mind, been part of the whole Chuck-era rejection. None of that is a reason for what they do. What they do is engineer a long, cruel scheme that will make Howard look like a drug addict in front of an important mediation. They want to tank his reputation. They want him humiliated. They want him broken. Kim is, in a lot of ways, the engine of this. Jimmy has doubts at different points. Kim keeps pushing. When Jimmy asks her if she really wants to go through with it, she smiles. She is, for the first time in her adult life, fully letting the buried part of her out of its cage. And Jimmy, who has loved that buried part of her since the beginning, cannot say no to her. The scheme works. Howard is humiliated in front of everyone who matters. His career, in a single afternoon, is destroyed. He confronts Jimmy and Kim in their apartment that night, furious, confused, trying to figure out what they even got out of doing this to him. And while he is in the middle of that confrontation, while he is standing in their living room with a drink in his hand, telling them what kind of people they really are, a cartel man named Lalo Salamanca walks through their front door. Lalo is not there about Howard. Lalo is there about Jimmy. Lalo shoots Howard in the head in the middle of the apartment, in front of both of them, just to clear the room. Howard dies on Jimmy and Kim's floor because he picked the wrong night to come over. That is the moment that everything the two of them had been building starts to fall apart for real. They survive the night with Lalo. They bury Howard's body in the desert with the help of Mike. They have to go on living with what they have done. And Kim, who had spent her whole adult life keeping everything inside, cannot keep this inside. This one she cannot run away from fast enough. Weeks later, Kim gives up her law license. She walks into the bar offices, signs the papers, and surrenders the things she had spent her whole life earning. She goes home. She tells Jimmy she loves him. And she tells him, in the quiet, steady voice that had always been the sound of her, that they are bad for everyone around them. That apart, they are okay. That together, they are something that gets people killed. She packs a bag. She leaves. Jimmy stays in the apartment. The show lingers on him alone in that glass countertop kitchen. He has just lost the only person who ever came close to being able to hold him still. And with her gone, there is nothing left to slow him down. The last weight is off. Every anchor he had to a quieter self, to a steadier life, to a version of himself that might have been possible if one or two things had gone differently, has been cut. The show then does something beautiful and brutal. It cuts from Jimmy standing in that kitchen, alone, to Jimmy a short time later, in a mansion, surrounded by marble and gold, with a new woman on each arm and a huge fluorescent desk and a big loud office of his own. The colors change. The music changes. Even the angles the camera chooses change. It is like we have walked into a different show. Because we have. The quiet Jimmy is gone. The man who sat in parking garages and smoked cigarettes with Kim is gone. Whatever was left of James Morgan McGill after the store and after the mailroom and after Chuck and after Kim has been packed away in a back closet of the mind. What is left is Saul Goodman. Not as a work persona Jimmy puts on in the morning. Not as a name on a business card. Saul Goodman as an entire way of being alive. Loud enough and fast enough and tacky enough that the man underneath never has to hear his own thoughts again. __quote _4 __. And the next question, the one the whole next stretch of his life is going to try to answer without ever quite asking it out loud, is simple. If the point of Saul Goodman is to never have to hear your own thoughts, how loud do you have to get before the quiet finally wins? Section 6. Saul Goodman is not a lawyer. He's a getaway vehicle. The office was the first clue. If you want to understand what Saul Goodman actually was, you have to look at the room he built around himself when nobody was stopping him anymore. Because the Saul Goodman office, the one in the strip mall, the one with the inflatable Statue of Liberty on the roof, the one with the big fake Greek columns and the Constitution printed all over the walls, was not an office. It was a costume. It was a costume the size of a room, and Jimmy was wearing it. Think about it for a second. Real lawyers do not decorate their offices like that. Real lawyers have wood panels and leather chairs and maybe a framed diploma. Saul had a desk made of something that looked like a spaceship. He had fake marble. He had gold. He had a bust of himself at one point sitting on a shelf. He had business cards that said he fought for you. He had billboards on the side of the highway with his giant smiling face on them. Everything about his professional setup screamed at you before you had even said hello. The screaming was the point. The screaming was doing a job, because as long as everything around him was loud enough, nobody was going to be able to hear the quiet person inside. Not the clients, not Walter White, not the judges or the other lawyers or the cartel men who came to see him. And most importantly, not Jimmy McGill himself. This is the thing about the Saul Goodman years that people sometimes miss. Saul is not a job. Saul is a getaway vehicle. A loud, shiny, fast-moving machine that Jimmy built to drive himself away from the person Chuck had told him he was. Away from the brother he had lost. Away from the woman who had left him. Away from the kid in the store in Cicero. The suits are part of the vehicle. The catchphrase is part of the vehicle. The office is part of the vehicle. Even the way he talks, the way his voice goes up and the words tumble out too fast, is part of the vehicle. Every single one of those choices is a piece of the escape. Let me give you the clearest line the show ever gave you about this. Right before Jimmy officially becomes Saul for his law practice, he tells Kim why he is doing it. He does not say it is for marketing. He does not say it is for fun. He says that Jimmy McGill, the lawyer, is always going to be Chuck McGill's loser brother. The name, he tells her, is burned. Jimmy cannot work under it. Every time somebody calls him Jimmy, all he is going to hear is his dead brother telling him he is a chimp with a machine gun. He needs a different name. Not because the old one is bad for business, because the old one hurts too much to answer to. That is a confession. Kim sees it as a confession. Her face in that scene is the face of somebody watching the person they love officially quit on himself. And once she sees it, the air goes out of her too. This is the conversation that leads, eventually, to her leaving him. The Saul Goodman briefcase tells the same story from another angle. Kim had gifted Jimmy a beautiful briefcase when he got his law license back. It had his real initials on it. JMM, James Morgan McGill. 3 letters that meant he was a person with a name and a family and a past. Once he rebrands, Jimmy cannot stand the initials anymore. So he takes that briefcase and he paints a new meaning over it. Same 3 letters, different words. Justice matters most. That is the story he tells himself. That this whole Saul thing is really about helping people. That he is here for the underdogs. That he is a champion of the little guy being ground up by the system. Later, in a jail cell, a cartel client named Lalo Salamanca looks at him sideways and offers a 3rd version of what those 3 letters might stand for. Just make money. And Jimmy, in that moment, hears it the way you hear a doctor telling you something you already suspected about yourself. He does not argue. Because Lalo is closer to the truth than the lie Jimmy had painted on his own briefcase. The whole Saul Goodman operation was never really about justice. It was about motion. It was about money because money bought motion. It was about cases because cases bought motion. It was about staying in the car with the engine running so nobody could catch up to him, including his own thoughts. You see the motion everywhere once you know to look for it. Saul does not sit in his chair. He leans, he paces, he spins around. He always seems to be halfway out of his own office, even when he is sitting behind his desk. He talks over people. He cracks jokes during serious moments. He makes deals in hallways and parking lots and diners because a room with a door that closes is a room where somebody might ask him a real question. He is always in the act of leaving, even when he is just arriving. That is not a personality. That is a man who cannot afford to stop. There is another part of Saul that is important to sit with, and it is uglier than the loud suits and the tacky office. In the years right after Chuck's death, before Jimmy is fully Saul Goodman, but while he is already using the name for his business on the side, he turns his grief into something mean. He goes after Howard Hamlin. Not in a big public way at first, in small, cruel, petty ways. He hires actors to pretend to be sex workers and yell at Howard in front of his lunch companions. He throws bowling balls down from an overpass onto the hood of Howard's car while Howard's family is inside the house. He sends prostitutes to disrupt Howard's business meetings. What makes this different from a normal rivalry is how little sense it makes from the outside. Howard has been trying to help Jimmy. Howard has offered him a job. Howard has admitted he was wrong about him. Howard has acknowledged the pain Jimmy is in over Chuck. And Jimmy's response is to try to destroy him. Kim, even Kim, cannot understand it at first. She asks Jimmy why he is doing this, and he cannot really answer. He shrugs it off. He calls Howard names. He pretends it is a joke. The reason, underneath, is that Howard is still alive. Howard had moved on from Chuck's death. Howard had gone to therapy. Howard was sleeping at night. And Jimmy, who had not done any of those things, who was still bleeding from that living room conversation and from the fire in Chuck's house, could not stand it. Somebody had to pay for Chuck being gone. Jimmy could not blame himself, because blaming himself would stop him in his tracks. He could not blame Chuck, because Chuck was dead and unreachable, and had been, underneath everything, the only person Jimmy had ever loved the way a little brother loves a big brother. So he blamed Howard. He picked the wrong man, and he made him the target. And he would not stop until they had ruined the man's life, and then watched him die on their own living room floor. That is what grief does when it is never named. It goes somewhere. It does not stay quiet. It comes out sideways as cruelty, as pettiness, as harassment of people who do not deserve it. The Howard storyline is not a side plot in the Saul Goodman years. It is the clearest picture the show ever gives you of what Saul Goodman was actually powered by. Not ambition, not greed. Unprocessed grief, running at full speed, with no brakes. By the time Jimmy is at his full Saul Goodman form, the one the original Breaking Bad audience met first, all of this is packed away underneath layers and layers of performance. You would not know any of it to look at him. The Saul Goodman who shows up on the Breaking Bad side of the story wears electric blue shirts. He has a pinky ring on his finger, the one Marco gave him in Cicero, a small, quiet piece of the real man carried along for the ride. He quotes movies he has not seen. He makes every serious conversation into a joke. He tells Walter White, the first time they meet, to give him a call anytime. He is open for business. He is the loudest, brightest, fastest version of himself he has ever been. Watch him, though, in the small gaps. Watch him when he thinks nobody is looking. In a few Breaking Bad scenes, and in a lot of Better Call Saul scenes, the camera lingers on Saul for a half a second after the joke has landed. His face goes still. His eyes go somewhere else. The motion stops, just for a beat, and you can see the Jimmy underneath the Saul, tired and scared and wishing he could figure out how to get out of the suit. Then he claps his hands together and says something stupid, and the motion starts up again, and we are back in the Saul Goodman show. The getaway vehicle works. For a long time, it works. Saul makes real money. Saul builds an actual client base. Saul becomes, in a twisted kind of way, one of the most successful criminal lawyers in Albuquerque. He is good at it. His skills from the slip and fall days and the Rolex scams translate perfectly to the courtroom. He knows how to read a jury. He knows how to work a judge. He knows how to pick the right story for the right person. Slippin Jimmy did grow up to be Saul Goodman, exactly the way Chuck had warned. And the horrifying thing is that Chuck was right. Jimmy did turn out to be a scam artist with a law degree. The only thing Chuck got wrong was thinking that meant Jimmy would fail. Jimmy did not fail. Jimmy thrived. But thriving inside the vehicle is not the same as being okay. Because a getaway vehicle is only useful as long as you are getting away. The moment you stop, the thing you were running from catches up to you. And Saul Goodman, for all his clients and all his billboards and all his jokes, was running from something very specific. And he could not outrun it forever. He could only outrun it until somebody finally dragged him, against his will, into a place so quiet and so empty that the thing he had been running from for his entire life could finally sit down next to him and say his real name out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before he got to that place, though, before the loud life collapsed and the quiet one began, there was a stretch of hours in the middle of the New Mexico desert where Jimmy stopped moving for the first time in decades. Not because he wanted to, because there was nowhere left to walk. And out there, with the sun going down and $7 million in duffel bags at his feet, an old man with a quieter voice than Chuck's was going to tell him the truth about the road he was on. Section 7. The desert, the cistern, and the first time Jimmy saw the road. The desert does something to a person that a city cannot. In a city, you can always keep moving. There is always a next block, a next meeting, a next bar to walk into. You can build a whole life out of never having to be still. But the desert, the real desert, the kind that sits just outside of Albuquerque and stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, does not let you do that. The desert forces a stop. Sooner or later, you stop walking because there is nowhere to walk to. You sit down, you look around, and whatever you have been running from for the last 30 years sits down next to you and waits. This is what happens to Jimmy in the 5th season, in a stretch of episodes that fans of the show still talk about as some of the most important hours of the whole series. The setup, on the surface, is simple. Jimmy is doing a job for Lalo Salamanca. Lalo is in jail. Lalo needs $7 million in cash to make bail. The cash is buried out in the desert. Jimmy is supposed to drive out there, pick up the money, and bring it back. Easy work, high pay. The kind of job Saul Goodman would take in a heartbeat, because he takes every job that keeps the motion going. What Jimmy does not know is that he has been marked. A rival cartel has gotten wind of the pickup. When Jimmy drives his nice, shiny, rented car out to the meet point, a group of gunmen is waiting for him. They ambush him. Bullets tear through the car. Jimmy is convinced in that moment that he is about to die. And he probably would have if Mike Ehrmantraut, Gus Fring's quiet old fixer, had not been watching from a hilltop with a rifle. Mike kills the gunman. Jimmy, shaking, covered in glass and sweat, does not really understand what just happened. He just knows that he is alive and that the car he drove out in has been shot to pieces and is not going to drive anywhere. And that there are $7 million on the ground in duffel bags. There is only one way out. They have to walk. Through the desert. Back to civilization. On foot. Carrying the money. What follows is 2 full episodes of television that barely have any dialogue in them. Jimmy in his nice suit, Mike in his regular jacket. The sun beating down on both of them. The duffel bags growing heavier with every step. No shade, no water, no plan except to keep moving in the direction of home. Jimmy, who has spent his entire adult life running at full speed through rooms full of people, now has to actually run, with his legs, across sand, in dress shoes, with bags that weigh more than he does. And here's the thing the show does with this, quietly, without ever announcing it. It takes every metaphor that has been sitting under the entire series, every hidden meaning about the road Jimmy has been on and the running he has been doing, and the price of the choices he has made, and it turns those metaphors into physical reality. The road Jimmy had been on, symbolically, for 50 years, is now a literal road in front of him, and it is stretching farther than his body can walk. The weight of his choices is now a literal weight in his hands. The thirst for something he cannot name is now a literal thirst. He cannot crack a joke his way out of any of this. He cannot charm the desert. He cannot put on a nice suit and fast talk the sun into setting early. He has to walk. That is all there is. And as he walks, something that has not happened to Jimmy in a very long time starts to happen. He starts to crack. Not in a big dramatic way, in small ways. He starts crying. He gets angry at Mike. He sits down on the ground and refuses to keep going. He throws up from dehydration. His expensive shoes fall apart. His suit hangs off him. His hair is wild. Every piece of the Saul Goodman costume is peeling away, not because anybody ripped it off him, but because the desert simply will not let a costume survive. You cannot be Saul Goodman with cracked lips and blood on your shirt. The desert will not allow it. What is left when the costume is gone is just a scared, middle-aged man carrying $7 million in a wasteland, alongside an old killer with a rifle, trying to get home. And at a certain point, the two of them stop. They find a small concrete cistern in the middle of nowhere, a tank of water that ranchers use for cattle. Jimmy, delirious, puts his whole head into it. He drinks until he can hardly breathe. Then they sit down, for the first time since the gunfight, and they rest. It is in this stillness, with the sun going down and the danger not yet over, that the scene happens. The scene that, if you really want to understand Jimmy McGill, you have to sit with. Mike, who has been watching this lawyer fall apart for 2 days, finally says something real to him. Mike talks about choices. Mike says, in his quiet, flat way, that we all make our choices, and those choices put us on a road. And sometimes the choices seem small when we make them, but they put us on the road. He says you think about getting off, you try, but eventually you are back on it. And the road, he says, led them out here, to this desert, to this night, to everything that had happened. And nothing could be done about that. This is the closest the show ever comes to stating the whole thesis of Jimmy's life out loud. Not through a narrator, not through a flashback, through an old man with a gun telling a lawyer the truth while they both catch their breath next to a watering trough. And Jimmy hears it. You can see him hear it. Just like he had heard Chuck hear it years before in the dark living room. He hears what Mike is saying. He knows, at some level he cannot fully admit to himself, that Mike is right. That the small choices he had made, going all the way back to the Marshall Field slip and the fake Rolex in the alley, and the first time he called himself Saul Goodman for a laugh, had put him on a road. That every time he had told himself he would get off the road later, after this next case, after this next payday, he had been lying to himself. That the road had already carried him so far from his starting point that the starting point was no longer visible. That he was not, as he had been pretending to himself for decades, making fresh choices every day. He was, instead, being carried by the weight of the choices he had already made, and the weight was enormous, and the road did not turn around. Mike does not say any of this to be cruel. Mike is telling him this because Mike has been on the same road. Mike had taken a small bribe once, decades ago, as a cop in Philadelphia. One bribe, one choice that had seemed small at the time. And that one choice had led, eventually, to the death of his son, to his retirement to New Mexico, to his work for Gus Fring, to this desert, to this cistern, to this night. Mike is not lecturing. Mike is telling his own story out loud, for Jimmy to hear, because they both have the same problem, and Jimmy does not yet know it. There is a beat, a quiet beat, after Mike finishes talking. Jimmy says something in response. He says something to the effect of, "So then what? We just keep going?" Mike looks at him. Mike does not answer in a way that lets Jimmy off the hook. Mike says yes. You keep going. That is what you do. So they keep going. They walk the rest of the way out of the desert. Jimmy gets the money to the courthouse. Lalo makes bail. Jimmy goes home to Kim, and when Kim asks him what happened out there, he lies, and she knows he is lying, and she asks him to tell her the truth, and he breaks down and tells her anyway, because he does not have the strength after the desert to keep the Saul costume fully on in front of her. And here is the thing. If you stop the show right there, if you pause the story on the moment after Jimmy tells Kim the truth about the desert, there was still a chance. He had seen the road. He had heard Mike name it. He had come home and taken the first real step anyone can take off a bad road, which is telling the truth about it to somebody who loves you. A different kind of show would have used this as the turning point. The desert breaks him. He comes home. He changes. But Better Call Saul is not that kind of show. Better Call Saul is a show about how seeing the road does not, by itself, get you off the road. Jimmy sees it. Jimmy understands it. And then, within a few weeks of walking out of that desert, he is back at work. He is back in the suit. He is back taking the calls. He is back running the plan against Howard Hamlin with Kim. He is back in the vehicle, driving it just as fast as before. Why? That is the question the show leaves you sitting with. Why, after you have seen the road, after an old killer has put it into words for you, after you have almost died trying to get off of it, do you go right back on? The answer the show gives, quietly, across the rest of Jimmy's life, is that the road is easier. That the alternative, which is stopping, which is sitting with what you have done, which is being with yourself long enough to hear your real thoughts, was scarier to Jimmy than any cartel, and any desert, and any gunfight. Getting off the road would have meant looking, for real, at the boy behind the counter in Cicero, at the brother he had helped destroy, at the woman he was slowly dragging down with him, at the father he had stolen from, at the self he had abandoned. Getting off the road would have meant picking up all of that weight and carrying it. And Jimmy had been telling himself for decades that he could not carry it. And so he chose to keep walking the road instead, because the road at least let him keep moving, which at least kept him from having to feel it. Mike had told him the truth. The road led to the desert and to everything that happened there, and straight back to where they were right now. And it would keep leading and leading and leading, whether Jimmy wanted it to or not. The road does not stop just because you figured it out. The road keeps going. 6___. And the next big stop on Jimmy's road, the stop that had been waiting for him since the very first day he met a certain chemistry teacher in a white hat, was the one that would finally turn Saul Goodman from a local lawyer with a strip mall office into something much bigger and much worse and much harder to come back from. Section 8. The Breaking Bad Years, or What running looks like when you finally arrive. The door of Saul Goodman's strip mall office opens one morning, and a science teacher in a brown jacket and a young man in a red hoodie walk in with a duffel bag full of money and a problem. The teacher has cancer. The teacher is cooking methamphetamine in a trailer out in the desert. The teacher needs a lawyer who can keep him out of jail and help him launder his money. And somebody told him to call Saul. The young man with him is scared and angry and does not want to be there. This is, for the original Breaking Bad audience, the first time you ever see Saul Goodman. This is how most people met the character. A clown in a loud suit, making jokes, offering Walter White and Jesse Pinkman advice in rapid-fire patter, cracking wise about bribes and witness intimidation, and all the other dark things he had apparently been doing for years before either of them walked through his door. The audience laughed. The audience enjoyed him. The audience, at the time, did not know anything about the man under the suit. Now, watching that first meeting again, after everything Better Call Saul showed us about who Jimmy McGill was, the scene plays completely differently. Because you are not watching a clown anymore. You are watching a man at the end of something. A man who has been running so hard for so long that he has arrived, finally, at the place running takes you. The smiling lawyer in the loud suit is what Jimmy looks like after the running has become the whole person. There is no other Jimmy underneath by this point. There is just the motion, the jokes, the angles, the deal-making, the suit. Think about what had to happen for Jimmy to be in that office on that morning, smiling at Walter White. Chuck was dead. Kim was gone. Howard was dead. Marco was dead. The law practice Jimmy had built his whole life toward had been traded in for a strip mall operation where the client base was drug dealers and men with guns, and people who needed someone to hide money for them. Everyone who had ever tried to hold Jimmy still had been removed from his life, one way or another. And what was left, on that morning, was a man with no one left to disappoint. When you have nobody to disappoint, you can do anything. That is the Saul Goodman era of the character, summed up in a sentence. There are no brakes because there is nobody in the passenger seat anymore. The Breaking Bad stretch of Jimmy's life is not short. It runs for years. He becomes Walter White's lawyer, then his cleaner, then his money man, then, in a twisted way, a kind of helpless partner. He finds them a man who can wash their cash. He finds them a safer place to cook. He warns them about the DEA. He helps them hide money from the IRS. He suggests hits on people who are a problem. He does all of this with a smile, and he does not flinch from any of it, and he keeps taking the checks. If you watch those years with the sound off, focusing only on his face, you start to see something interesting. Saul Goodman is not happy. He is not unhappy exactly either. He is more like a man who has stopped feeling anything at all. The wide grin is always there, but it is not connected to joy. It is a grin the way a sign hanging on a shop door is a sign. It means he is open for business. It does not mean he is glad to see you. The deep feelings that had animated the earlier Jimmy, the hope for Chuck's approval, the love for Kim, the grief after both were gone, have been buried so thoroughly under so many layers of performance that you would have to dig through years of suits and catchphrases and strip mall advertising to find them. And Jimmy is not going to let you dig. There is an important thing to notice here that ties back to Cicero. Remember, back in the alleys, when Jimmy used to lie down on the sidewalk and pretend to be broken so strangers would give him money. That was the first scam. The scam where you make yourself look helpless so the mark feels bad for you and opens the wallet. Watch Saul Goodman with Walter White across the run of Breaking Bad, and you will see that exact scam running, over and over, under a new set of clothes. Every time Walt threatens him, Saul goes into the flinch. Saul raises his hands. Saul backs away. Saul calls him Sir. Saul makes himself small and helpless and pitiful. Saul slips and falls, in a way, in front of Walt, dozens of times across those seasons. And the reason is not that Saul is actually afraid of Walt. Or at least, not only that. The reason is that making yourself small in front of a bigger man was the first move Jimmy ever learned. Back when his father was the bigger man at the store. Back when Chuck was the bigger man in Albuquerque. The move comes out of him automatically now. He cannot turn it off. Walt raises his voice, and Jimmy is, suddenly, 10 years old again, in a back room somewhere, figuring out how to survive by making the bigger man feel pity or annoyance or embarrassment instead of real anger. This is why the relationship between Saul and Walt plays the way it does. It is not really a partnership. It is the pattern from Jimmy's childhood, dressed up in a $1,000 suit. Walt is Chuck for Jimmy in these years, the bigger man with the better credentials, the man you want approval from even when you know the approval will not come, the man whose dismissal of you stings no matter how many times you tell yourself you do not care. Saul works for Walt not just because of money. Saul works for Walt because Walt is the available version of the dynamic Jimmy has been in his whole life, and he would not know how to function outside of it. You can see this in the scene from the 8th episode of Breaking Bad's 2nd season, the one titled Better Call Saul, where Jimmy meets Walt and Jesse for the first time. They drag him out into the desert in the dead of night. They put him on his knees with a plastic bag over his head. They threaten to kill him. And what does Jimmy do? He panics. He talks fast. He blurts out a name he thinks they want to hear. He says it was not him. It was Ignacio. He says Lalo did not send you. He keeps talking. He keeps performing. He does every trick he knows to keep the bigger men from pulling the trigger. The original Breaking Bad audience watched that and thought it was funny. The man in the suit, panicking in the desert, offering up a bunch of nonsense to save his own skin. It was funny. But Better Call Saul, years later, would take that same scene and show you what Jimmy was really doing in those seconds. The Ignacio he was blurting out was a real person Jimmy had known, a man named Nacho, who had been dragged into the cartel world partly because of Jimmy's own choices, and who had died a hard death trying to get out. Lalo was a real cartel killer who had once held Jimmy and Kim at gunpoint in their own apartment. Those were not jokes. Those were the worst nights of Jimmy's life, being handed to a couple of strangers in the desert as a bribe for mercy. That is what the Saul Goodman years look like once you know the whole story. Every funny line is a scar. Every quick joke is a memory he is trying to hand away. Every time Saul laughs in a Breaking Bad scene, he is throwing the memory of somebody, often somebody he loved, into the space between himself and the person he is talking to, so that person cannot see him clearly. The laughing is a smokescreen. The man behind the smokescreen is empty and tired. The thing that finally breaks the whole Saul Goodman operation is not anything Saul does himself. It is Walter White's house of cards coming down. Walt's brother-in-law, a DEA agent named Hank Schrader, finally pieces it together. There is a shootout. People die. Walt goes on the run. Saul, tied to Walt by paperwork and phone records and shell companies and the whole visible trail of money, becomes one of the hottest names in New Mexico for the DEA to chase. He cannot stay in Albuquerque. He cannot keep his office. He cannot keep his life. In the next to last episode of Breaking Bad, Saul and Walt are both holed up in an underground bunker, waiting their turns to be taken away by a man named Ed Galbraith. Ed is known as the Disappearer. You pay him, he picks you up, he drives you to a new life, with a new name, in a new place, and you start over. Both Walt and Saul are going through the process. They are waiting. They are saying their goodbyes to their old lives, in their own ways. And this is where the line happens. The line that, years later, a whole spin-off series would be named around. Saul, trying to keep his spirits up, or maybe just trying to manage his own fear with a joke, says to Walter White that if he is lucky, a month from now, best case scenario, he is going to be managing a Cinnabon in Omaha. It is a throwaway line. It gets a small laugh. Walt barely reacts. The line is meant to show that Saul has completely given up on any version of the life he had built, that he is resigned to ending up as a nobody at a mall in a city he has never been to. But look closer at what he is really saying in that moment. He is saying, basically, that the best outcome he can imagine for himself is total anonymity. A mall job, a uniform, a place where nobody knows his name, a place so ordinary that nobody would ever look twice at him. For a man who has spent his entire life running at full speed in the loudest clothes he can find, the secret dream he is confessing to Walt is a dream of stillness. A dream of a life so quiet that nobody could ever find him in it. That is the confession under the joke. Saul has been running his whole life, and in the middle of a bunker, waiting to be driven into his next life, he admits to Walter White that the best he can hope for now is to finally stop. Not because he wants to, because there is nothing left of the run that is worth doing. All the people who were worth running for or running from are gone. All the reasons to keep moving have burned out. He is empty, and he is tired. And the best he can imagine is a little booth in a food court in a part of the country he has never cared about. Ed, the Disappearer, eventually comes for him. He takes him away. Saul gets in the van. The camera watches Albuquerque shrink in the distance behind him. The suits, the office, the pinky ring, the billboards, the name Saul Goodman itself, all of it starts to peel off of him the moment the van crosses the state line. And when the van stops, days later, at a small apartment in a very cold city, a man who is not Jimmy McGill and not Saul Goodman anymore steps out into the snow and begins, for the first time in his whole life, to find out what his days look like when they do not involve running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The stillness he had been joking about in the bunker was about to become his whole world. And what he was going to discover very quickly was that the stillness was not peace. The stillness was a room, and the room had been waiting for him his entire life. And there was somebody sitting in the corner of it. And the person in the corner was himself. Section 9. Gene Takavic and the stillness he could not bear. The first thing you notice about Omaha in the way the show films it is that the color has been drained out of the world. Everywhere else Jimmy had ever lived had been loud and warm. Albuquerque was hot yellow light and red rock and pink neon on the side of his billboard. Cicero was snow and alleys and the warm orange glow of a bar at closing time. Even the desert, as bad as it had been out there, had been a color. The sun, the dust, the sand, the blood on his shirt. Omaha is in black and white. Every time the show returns to Gene Takavic, the man Jimmy becomes after Ed the Disappearer drives him away from New Mexico, the color leaves the screen. No reds, no blues, no warm light at all. Just gray and white and shadow. The choice is the show's way of telling you, without saying it, that whatever Jimmy became in Omaha was not really alive. It was a waiting room, a pause, a stretch of time where Jimmy's heart kept beating, but the rest of him had been turned off. Here is the life Gene Takavic is living. He is the manager of a Cinnabon in a shopping mall. He wears a visor and an apron. His mustache is plain. His glasses are plain. His shirt is plain. He rides into work in the early morning before the stores open, and he counts the trays of cinnamon rolls coming out of the ovens. He trains the teenagers who work the counter. He calls the corporate office about the receipts. He watches the customers come in. He watches them leave. He goes home, alone, to a small apartment with heavy curtains and a television. He watches old movies in black and white. He eats something simple. He goes to bed. He does not have friends. He does not have anyone to call. He barely talks to anyone except about cinnamon rolls. This is supposed to be his new life, forever. This is the trade he made. His freedom for his anonymity. His old, loud self for a new, quiet one. He is supposed to live like this, calmly, carefully, until he dies of old age in this apartment. And nobody will ever know that the gray, quiet man running the Cinnabon used to be the guy on all those billboards back in New Mexico. That was the deal. That was the promise. And it is killing him. You do not see it in big, obvious ways at first. You see it in the smallest possible details, which is part of why the Gene scenes are some of the most quietly devastating scenes the show ever produced. Watch, for example, the famous scene where Gene is closing up the Cinnabon one night and takes a bag of trash out to the mall's back corridor. The door closes behind him. It locks. He is trapped in a small concrete room with a dumpster. There is an emergency exit right there, a door to the outside, a door that would instantly get him out of the situation. But there is a sign on the door that says, if you open this, the police will be called. A normal person in that situation would push the door. You are not a criminal for wanting to leave a locked trash room. At worst, a security guard would come, laugh, let you out, write a little report. Nothing would happen to you. But Gene cannot push the door. Because what if? What if a bored cop ran his name? What if some computer somewhere flagged him? What if? He has spent so long running that the idea of even a single pair of police eyes touching his paperwork is too much to bear. So he does not push the door. He stays in the little concrete room. He sits down. He waits. And over the next 2.5 hours, he just sits there, alone, waiting for the night cleaning crew to eventually come by and let him out. This is a man who used to rule a strip mall empire. This is a man who once put an inflatable Statue of Liberty on top of his own office. This is a man who now cannot handle the idea of opening a door. While he is sitting in there, alone, he takes out a loose screw from somewhere and he scratches 2 letters into the wall. S.G. Saul Goodman. He adds the words, "was here." He carves it into the wall, very quietly, because he needs somebody to know he existed. Not the Cinnabon guy, the real man, the loud one, the one who used to matter, the one he used to be. Nobody is ever going to read that carving. He knows that. It is in a trash room. Nobody with a clue who Saul Goodman was is ever going to come out the back door of that Cinnabon and find that little scratch in the wall. He is writing a message to an audience of 0. He is writing it for himself. because the self under the jean costume is suffocating and needs to see proof that it still exists. Every scene with Gene has this quality. He goes home one night, opens a hidden compartment in his closet, and pulls out an old shoebox he has kept from his previous life. He digs out a VHS tape. He puts the tape in his player, sits down on the couch, and watches. The tape is a compilation of his old television commercials from Albuquerque. The cheap, loud, flashy ads where Saul Goodman pointed into the camera and promised to fight for you. He watches his old self on screen, and he begins to cry. You have to sit with this, because this is a lot. This is a middle-aged man, alone in an apartment in the middle of the country, watching old commercials of himself, weeping. This is the safety of his new life pressing down on his chest so hard he cannot breathe. Not because his new life is dangerous, because his new life is quiet. Because the quiet is making him hear himself for the first time in years, and he does not like what he hears. This is what the whole series has been building toward for this character. His entire life, Jimmy had been running. Cicero, the mailroom, the law practice, the Saul Goodman empire. Every day had been full of motion. Every day had been full of other voices, other people's problems, other people's attention. Billboards, commercials, clients, scams. The whole point, whether he knew it or not, had been to fill his days and nights with so much noise that the voice at the bottom of him could never be heard. Omaha takes all the noise away. Omaha hands him silence. Omaha hands him hours and hours, day after day, where the only voice he can hear is his own. And he discovers very quickly that his own voice is unbearable. The voice says things like, "You did this." The voice says things like, "Your brother died because of you." The voice says things like, "Kim left because of what you turned her into." The voice says things like, "Look at yourself. Look at what you became. Look at what you did to get here." He cannot turn that voice off. So what does he do? He starts running again. Not out of Omaha at first, just in small ways, inside Omaha. A cab driver named Jeff, who is somehow from Albuquerque, recognizes him one day and demands that he say his old catchphrase. Gene, in a panic, says it. Better call Saul. The cab driver lets him go, but Gene, rattled, goes home and calls Ed the disappearer and tries to arrange another disappearing. A second life change, a second new name, a second hiding place. Then, mid-phone call, he stops. He hangs up. He tells Ed out loud, "I am going to fix it myself." That sentence is the turning point of the Gene era, because what he is really saying is that the quiet life is no longer working. The careful hiding is no longer enough. The Gene costume is so thin now that a single man from his past looking at his face was enough to make it crack. The only way to keep himself in one piece, Gene decides, is to lean back into the old skill set, the old tricks, the old running. So he does. He cooks up a plan. Jeff, the cab driver, and Jeff's slow friend Buddy become his new Marcos. Gene gives them the same thing Marco once had, a taste of the hustle. The plan is to break into a department store in the mall where Gene works. Gene, with all his decades of scam-running expertise, engineers the perfect setup. He befriends the security guard by bringing him Cinnabon rolls. He times how long it takes the guard to eat each roll. He builds a fake store layout in a field somewhere, practicing. He picks the exact items Jeff should grab. He plans every second. The night of the heist, one of the most important small details in the entire show appears on screen. Gene, at home before the job, opens a drawer. He takes out a ring. Marco's pinky ring. The one Marco's mother had given him in the alley in Cicero decades ago, after Marco had died running one last scam at Jimmy's side. Gene slides the ring onto his finger. He does not say anything. The camera does not underline it, but the meaning is enormous. Gene is calling up Slippin Jimmy. Gene is pulling, out of the past, the version of himself that scammed people in alleys in the snow. The version that felt most alive. The version Marco had loved. He needs that version of himself to get through the night. So he puts the ring on. And for the first time since Omaha began, the light in his eyes comes back. The heist, technically, is a success. Jeff gets in, grabs the items, gets out. Gene covers his tracks. He even scares Jeff out of ever crossing him again. But look at the whole operation from a little distance and ask yourself what it actually accomplished. Gene already had money. Gene already had a safe life. Gene did not need a single thing from that department store. He ran the scam because the running was the whole point. Because scratching the itch was the only way he knew to feel like himself. Because standing still had become a worse fate than being caught. That is the moment the running becomes pure. No more reasons. No more excuses. No more, I am doing this for Chuck, or I am doing this for Kim, or I am doing this for my clients. Just the running, for its own sake. A drug a man cannot quit. After the heist works, Gene does not stop. Of course he does not. He calls his old secretary Francesca, back from the Albuquerque days, and finds out that Kim had reached out about him. He calls Kim. She tells him, gently, that he should turn himself in. And Gene, hearing the thing from her that he cannot bear to hear, lashes out at her. He twists the conversation. He makes it her fault. He hangs up on her. The conversation ends, and he is alone again in his apartment, and the Kim-sized hole in him is bigger now than before, and there is only one thing in his life that fills that kind of hole. More running. More scams. He finds Jeff and Buddy again. He brings them in on a new thing. Identity theft. They pick targets. Rich men, drunk, lonely, leaving bars late at night. Gene drugs them in casual bar encounters. Jeff and Buddy drive the drunk men home, take their passwords, copy their bank details. Gene, back at his apartment, uses the information to quietly drain their accounts. It is not a game anymore. It is not a one-time heist for fun. It is a business, a running, ongoing operation, growing every week. Buddy, the slow one, draws a line eventually. They target one last mark, a sick man dying of cancer alone in his house. Buddy, looking at the man, refuses. He tells Gene, I can't do this. This guy is dying. Gene tells Buddy to get out. Gene, who once sat in a courtroom with Lalo Salamanca and felt sick about defending a murderer, decides to do the cancer guy job himself. He slips into the dying man's house. He is inside when the man wakes up. The man sees him, not clearly, not fully, but enough. And Gene, for one long moment, considers what to do. The man is old. The man is weak. The man is dying. There is a phone nearby. There is a cord. There are a lot of things in that room that could, with very little effort from Gene, make sure this sick old man does not live long enough to describe him to the police. Gene almost does it. You can see it on his face, the calculation, the idea, The feeling that a lifetime of smaller choices has brought him to this kitchen. And now the road Mike talked about in the desert is asking him, are you going to go that far? Are you going to become the thing you always stopped just short of being? He does not do it. Something in him, some last echo of the boy behind the counter in Cicero, will not let him close his hands around a dying man's throat. He leaves the house. He gets away. But the fact that he even paused, the fact that he considered it for that long, tells you where the running has brought him. He is one small decision away from being the thing he had spent his whole life telling himself he was not. It all unravels shortly after. Jeff's mother, a sweet older woman named Marion, recognizes him. She pieces together from an old Saul Goodman commercial she watches online that the nice, quiet Gene from the neighborhood is actually the wanted man from Albuquerque. She calls the police. Gene, in her kitchen, hears her make the call. For one terrible second, he looks at her the way he had looked at the dying man in the house. She is old. She is small. She is alone in the kitchen with him. And the show lets the second last a few beats too long enough for you to feel, in your stomach, exactly what kind of choice is being considered. He does not do it to her either. He turns. He runs, actually runs this time, physically out of the house. He sprints through a snowy backyard in his gray coat. He ducks and hides and climbs fences. The black and white photography is beautiful, and it is a literal picture of the whole man at last. This is what the running has always looked like. This is what he has been doing inside his mind for 50 years. Now, in the last minutes of his freedom, he is doing it with his legs, through the snow, away from an old woman who had been kind to him. Away from the version of himself he had almost become in her kitchen. Away from everything. And this time, he cannot outrun them. The police are everywhere. The sirens close in. He hides in a dumpster, of all places, looking up at the sky. Lights flash past. He is breathing hard. He is sweating through the winter cold. And when the lid of the dumpster finally opens, an officer is standing over him with a flashlight. Jimmy McGill. James Morgan McGill. The kid from the store. Slippin Jimmy. Saul Goodman. Gene Takavic. All of them at once. All of them still stitched together inside one exhausted body. Looks up from the garbage with his hands slowly rising. The running is over. Not because he stopped, because they caught him. And what happens next, in the final courtroom he will ever stand in, is the only moment in his entire life where Jimmy McGill stops running by choice. Section 10. The courtroom, the confession, and the 40 seconds Jimmy stopped running. He is in a small jail somewhere in Nebraska when the dust settles. They have him. They know who he is. The mustache is still there. The glasses are still there. The man inside has been Gene for so long that a piece of Gene is not going to come off easily, even now that the paperwork has all been handed over and everybody in the room knows his real name. He is Saul Goodman again, legally, officially. The federal prosecutors are coming. The charges are stacking up. Murder by conspiracy, money laundering, drug trafficking, fraud. The list is so long that when it is read out loud in the courtroom, it sounds like a weather report for a storm that has already destroyed everything it was ever going to destroy. The number they put on him, if he goes to trial and loses, is life plus 190 years. That is not a normal sentence. That is the system telling him, in its own formal voice, that there is no amount of time on earth that would be enough to hold what he has done. They are stacking sentences like bricks, building a wall that will outlive him by centuries. And this is where Saul Goodman, the loud, fast-talking version of Jimmy McGill, the getaway vehicle he had built and driven for decades, sits down at a table across from a team of federal prosecutors and starts to do what he does best. He starts to negotiate. He puts on the suit, not literally, but in every way that matters. The patter comes back. The confidence comes back. The jokes come back. He walks into that room knowing he is the smartest person in it, and within the first 10 minutes, he has the prosecutors on their back foot. The vehicle still runs. After everything, after the desert, after Chuck, after Kim, after Omaha, after the dumpster in the snow, the Saul Goodman machine still fires up when he turns the key. He plays on their egos. He tells them stories. He dangles information about Walter White they desperately want. He turns on every trick that every bar con and every courtroom argument of his entire life taught him. And he does the impossible. He whittles a life plus 190-year sentence down to 7 years. 7. In a soft facility. Possibly in North Carolina. Possibly with ice cream privileges, which he demands and which they agree to, because at this point, they will give him almost anything to close the deal. Saul Goodman, the man who once conned a drunk out of a wallet for a fake Rolex in a Cicero alley, is about to perform the greatest con of his entire life in a federal courtroom. He has beaten the system. Again. He has talked his way out of the wall of bricks. And then he does something no version of this man had ever done before. He gets a message from home. He learns that Kim, his ex-wife, the woman he had not seen in years, has come forward. She has signed a statement, a long, careful written confession about what she and Jimmy had really done to Howard Hamlin, about the scheme, about the fake letters, about the cocaine they had faked onto his reputation, about the mediation that had destroyed him, about the night Lalo had come through their door and shot Howard in the head on their living room floor. She has told the truth about all of it. Not because anybody made her, because she could not carry it anymore. She has handed the statement to Howard's widow and to the authorities, and she has walked back into her quiet life in Florida, knowing that she is finally named, in her own handwriting, the worst thing she ever did. Kim has, in other words, stopped running. And somewhere inside Saul Goodman, inside that wall of a man who has spent his whole life making himself harder to catch, something finally starts to move in the opposite direction. Not a dramatic turnaround, not a lightning bolt, just a small, slow turn. He makes a phone call. He tells the prosecutors he has more information. He tells them he has something big, something important, something about Chuck, his dead brother. He says he is willing to testify about it, to expand the deal, to give them more. The prosecutors, smelling more blood in the water, agree. They add the testimony to the sentencing hearing. They let him speak on the record. He asks for one thing. He asks that Kim be there in the courtroom. He says he wants her to hear him testify. She agrees to come. She flies in. She sits in the back of the room. She is wearing plain clothes and plain hair and the same steady face she had in the parking garage of HHM many years before. She is watching him, just like she had always watched him. And here, in front of the judge and the prosecutors and his old secretary Francesca and his ex-wife and a room full of reporters, Saul Goodman, in his suit, stands up to speak. He starts the way he always starts, smooth, practiced. He is still Saul in those opening seconds. He is still running the plan. He begins by talking about Walter White, exactly the way the prosecutors want him to. He is about to walk into the trap they had set together, which was supposed to paint him as a hostage of Walter White, a victim of a man who had threatened him and his family. This is the story he is supposed to sell. This is the story that was going to keep him at 7 years. But as he talks, you see his mouth start to disobey him. Small words change. Small emphases shift. He starts telling the truth about Walter White instead of the story they had agreed on. He starts admitting things he did not have to admit. He starts saying that he was not a victim, that he was a partner, that Walt would never have built the empire he built without Saul Goodman's help, that Saul had made him rich, that Saul had helped him get away with things no ordinary criminal could have gotten away with. The prosecutors, at their table, start to sit up a little straighter. This is not the speech they had prepared with him. The judge is listening carefully. The room is very quiet. The 7-year deal is starting to wobble. And then he moves on to Howard. He tells the courtroom, on the record, for everyone to hear, what he and Kim had done to Howard Hamlin. He tells them about the scheme. He tells them about destroying a man's reputation in front of everyone he worked with. He tells them Howard died because of what he and Kim had set in motion. He says it plainly. He does not soften it. And then, most importantly, he moves on to Chuck. He talks about his brother. He talks about what he did to him. He talks about going behind Chuck's back and tampering with his malpractice insurance. He talks about contributing to Chuck's career collapse. He talks about what came after. The fire, the lantern, everything. And he makes the astonishing admission, on the record, that he believes his actions played a part in Chuck's death. His own lawyer, sitting at the table, is whispering to him to stop, trying to catch his eye, trying to signal that he is blowing up the deal. Saul does not stop. Because here is what is actually happening, underneath the words of the testimony. For the first time in 50 years, Jimmy McGill is turning around and looking at the road behind him. The road Mike had named in the desert. The road that had led from the store in Cicero, through the mailroom, through the dark living room where Chuck had destroyed him, through the apartment where Kim had left him, through the strip mall where Saul had been born, through the bunker where he had said the Cinnabon line, through the silent black and white of Omaha. All of it. The whole road. And he is looking at it. Not running from it anymore. Just looking. And the first thing he does when he looks at the road is say, out loud, in front of witnesses, that he built it. That the men who got hurt on it got hurt because of him. That he was not a passenger. He was the driver. He had always been the driver. The story Saul Goodman had been telling the prosecutors, the story of Saul Goodman as Walter White's hostage, was the last and biggest con of his life. And he was, finally, refusing to sell it. He ends his testimony by saying the thing that sets the whole courtroom still. He says, for the record, the name is McGill. Jimmy McGill. Not Saul Goodman. Not Gene Takavic. Not Slippin Jimmy. Jimmy McGill. The boy from the store. The mailroom kid. Chuck's little brother. The man Kim had fallen in love with. The one underneath all the costumes. He reaches up and in a small, quiet gesture takes Saul Goodman's name off himself, the way you would take off a coat after a very long walk. The deal is over. Everyone in the courtroom knows it. The prosecutors close their folders. 7 years is gone. The number that replaces it when the judge finally speaks is 86 years. A whole life and then some. A number big enough to hold everything he had ever done. He walks out of that room in shackles. And he is smiling. Not the Saul Goodman smile. Not the billboard grin. A different smile. Tired. A little wet around the eyes. The smile of a man who has been carrying something enormous for his whole life, and finally, in the last possible minute, put it down. On the bus to prison, other inmates recognize him. They start chanting his old name. Saul, Saul, better call Saul. He looks out the window. He is polite about it. He does not correct them. He does not claim it either, because it is not his name anymore. He left it on a table in a courtroom in Albuquerque. At the prison, at some point after the sentencing, Kim comes to visit him. She uses her old bar card, technically expired but never turned in, to get in as his lawyer. She is not there as his lawyer. She is there as Kim. She walks through the halls. She is wearing jeans. Her hair is plain. Her face is calm. He is already standing by the fence in the yard when she arrives. He does not say much. She does not say much. They stand near each other. He lights a cigarette. She lights one too. They share it, the way they had shared one in a parking garage of HHM many years before. Back before any of this. That garage and this yard are now the two bookends of their whole life together. A cigarette at the beginning, a cigarette at the end, and in between every single mile of the road. They do not kiss. They do not hold hands. They just stand there, quietly, smoking, looking at each other. He knows where he is. She knows where he is. Neither of them pretends it is going to be different. The 86 years are the 86 years. He is not getting out. When the time is up, she turns to go. He looks at her as she walks away. And he does the one thing Saul Goodman used to do. The one piece of the old persona he has carried with him. He points at her with finger guns. But the finger guns are not Saul's anymore. There is no electricity in them, no flash, no wink. They are a small, tired, warm goodbye between two people who loved each other and who are not going to see each other again for a long time, if ever. They are the gesture of a real person who has finally, after a lifetime, stopped pretending. Kim walks out into the parking lot. She gets in her car. She drives away. The camera stays with her for a while, and then it stays with him. And then it lets the screen go dark. That is where the show ends. And if you sit with that ending long enough, you realize what the whole series, all 63 episodes of Better Call Saul, and every Saul Goodman scene of Breaking Bad before it, had really been about. It had been about a man running. Running from the store. Running from his father. Running from Chuck. Running from his own name. Running from the woman he loved. Running from the quiet. Running through suits and catchphrases and inflatable statues and fake Rolexes and dumpsters and snow and desert and shopping mall trash rooms and bar cons and courtroom tricks. Never looking back. Because looking back would have meant seeing the road. And seeing the road would have meant carrying the weight of it. And he did not believe, for his entire adult life, that he had the strength to carry it. And then, in a courtroom, on a day he could have walked out of with a cushy 7-year deal, he decided, for reasons he never fully put into words, that he would rather carry the weight than keep running from it. He turned around. He looked at the whole road. He said out loud, "I am the man who built this." He accepted the number. He walked out in shackles. And he smiled, because for the first time in his life, he was standing still. The running was the cage. The weight was the freedom. He had carried the cage with him for 50 years because he thought it was lighter than the freedom. And it turned out, on the last day of his freedom, that he had been carrying it the wrong way around the whole time. That is why Saul Goodman was always running. Not from the law, not from the cartel, not even from the ghosts of Chuck and Howard and Marco. He was running from the simple, impossible act of sitting down inside his own life and owning what it contained. And the only real victory of the whole series, the only one that really counts, is that for a few minutes, on a quiet day in a federal courtroom, with Kim watching from the back row, he finally put the running down. And when you step back from the whole story, from the Cicero winters and the mailroom years and the dark living room where Chuck said the 9 words, and the desert where Mike named the road, and the black and white Cinnabon where Gene carved his initials into a wall, and the courtroom where Jimmy finally said the name the man had always been, one quiet question gets left with you as the final credits roll. One question that reaches far past this one show, into every life watching it, including yours. And it is the question the essay would like to leave you with now. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.